The human engineer stood in the vast hangar, his tools scattered across a workbench. His fingers moved swiftly as he adjusted the settings on a few devices. Today, like any other day, his task was to repair and maintain the equipment for the peacekeeping mission. The planet they were stationed on was peaceful, but tensions in the galaxy were never too far. His job was to make sure that the technology didn't fail when needed. The clanking of boots on the metal floor echoed through the empty space. He glanced up to see the towering figure of an alien warrior approaching. Kalira, a member of a fierce and proud species, walked with a confidence that was unmistakable. Her armor, shining silver and etched with complex designs, gleamed in the artificial light of the hangar. The engineer stood up straight, his eyes widening slightly as he saw her approach. Kalira was unlike anyone he had ever met. Her species was known throughout the galaxy for their strength and combat skills. They were a warrior race, often feared by others for their ruthlessness in battle. Her reputation preceded her, and the stories he had heard about her were nothing short of legendary. Kalira stopped in front of him, her dark eyes studying him closely. She wasn't smiling, but there was something in her expression that made the engineer feel uneasy. "I need you to repair my armor," Kalira said, her voice firm and clear. It wasn't a request. It was an order. The engineer nodded quickly, trying not to show how nervous he felt. "Of course, ma'am, I'll get to work right away." He moved toward the armor, carefully setting his tools aside and preparing to take it apart. He had repaired alien technology before, but nothing quite like this. Kalira's armor was a masterpiece of engineering, designed to withstand the harshest environments and the most brutal combat. The intricate details of its design were fascinating, and the engineer couldn't help but marvel at its complexity as he ran his fingers over the surface. Kalira remained silent as he worked, her eyes never leaving him. The engineer felt the weight of her gaze but did his best to ignore it. He had learned long ago not to be distracted when working on delicate machinery. "Be careful," Kalira said suddenly, her voice calm but sharp. "My armor is more sensitive than it appears." The engineer froze, his hands hovering over a set of controls. "I'll be gentle, don't worry," he replied, trying to sound reassuring. Kalira didn't respond immediately, but he could sense her, watching him closely. Her posture was stiff, and there was a slight tension in the air. It was as if she was assessing every move he made. The engineer couldn't help but feel a bit of pressure under her gaze. He gently began to work on the armor, carefully adjusting the pieces that had been damaged during a recent skirmish. The armor's surface was smooth and cold, and he felt the weight of it in his hands. As he made the repairs, he tried to focus solely on the task at hand, but every time he glanced up, Kalira was still watching him. "How long have you been on this planet?" Kalira asked, suddenly breaking the silence. "About 6 months," the engineer replied, his voice steady despite the awkwardness of the situation. "Just long enough to get the hang of things." She nodded, her gaze never leaving him. "I see. And how does it feel to work among warriors?" The engineer paused for a moment, unsure how to answer. He had never thought much about it. Most of the soldiers he had worked with on the mission were kind enough, but none of them were like Kalira. "It's different," he said finally. "But it's an honor to be here, helping out." Kalira studied him for a long moment, and he wondered if she was judging him or simply lost in thought. He couldn't tell. Her face was unreadable, her expression as hard as the armor she wore. As the engineer worked, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of discomfort. He wasn't used to working in such close proximity to someone like Kalira. Her presence was imposing, and despite her calm demeanor, there was an air of danger surrounding her. It was as if she could explode into action at any moment. His fingers trembled slightly as he worked on the final section of the armor. The pressure of her gaze was almost too much to bear, and he found himself wondering if he was doing the job right. After a few moments, Kalira spoke again. "You're being too careful." The engineer's hands froze in place. "What do you mean?" "You're handling my armor like it's fragile," Kalira explained, her voice taking on a hint of annoyance. "I'm not fragile." The engineer's heart skipped a beat. He had always been careful when working with alien technology, especially with something as important as Kalira's battle armor. But now, with her words hanging in the air, he wasn't sure what she expected. He tried to explain, "I'm just being cautious. I want to make sure it's repaired properly." Kalira's expression softened ever so slightly. "I didn't ask for caution," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I asked for a repair." The engineer blinked, realizing the tension between them had shifted. He had assumed that Kalira's demeanor was cold and unapproachable, but now it seemed like there was more to her than he had initially thought. With a deep breath, the engineer steadied his hands and prepared to finish the repair. He couldn't let her unsettling presence distract him. He was here to do a job, and that's exactly what he planned to do. As his tools worked against the cold metal of the armor, Kalira remained silent, her watchful eyes following his every movement. The air between them seemed to thicken, filled with something unspoken. The engineer couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew one thing for certain. His encounter with Kalira was going to be far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The engineer carefully worked on Kalira's armor, his hands moving swiftly but with caution. He knew how important this task was, and he had never taken such a request lightly. The weight of Kalira's silent gaze made it difficult for him to focus, but he kept his thoughts on the task at hand. Kalira's eyes never left him, and as the minutes passed, the engineer began to feel the pressure building. The silence between them grew thick, like the air before a storm. He could sense that Kalira was not used to being treated with such care, and something in the way she stood made it clear that she was not someone who would tolerate weakness or hesitation. The engineer worked steadily, his tools clicking against the metal of the armor, adjusting small components and fixing any flaws he found. Yet, despite his focus, he couldn't shake the feeling that Kalira was scrutinizing every move he made. Her presence so commanding made him second-guess even the simplest actions. "Are you always so gentle with your repairs?" Kalira's voice broke the silence, and the engineer's hand jerked slightly. He quickly regained his composure. "I just want to make sure everything is in perfect working order," he explained, trying to keep his voice steady. Kalira raised an eyebrow. "I see." She said nothing more, but the engineer couldn't shake the feeling that she was assessing him, not just his work. As he continued to repair her armor, he noticed her posture change slightly. She seemed to relax a little, though the intensity in her gaze remained. The sharpness that had been so evident earlier was now replaced by something more curious. "I've never seen an engineer handle armor like this," Kalira said, her voice softer than before. "Most people are afraid to touch it. They treat it like it's fragile." The engineer paused for a moment. He looked up at her, trying to gauge her expression. There was no anger in her voice, no challenge, just an observation. But for some reason it made him feel even more uncertain. "I'm just used to being careful with alien technology," he replied, his fingers still gently moving over the armor's surface. "I've worked on some complicated systems, but this is different." Kalira nodded, her gaze still fixed on him. "It's not the armor that's different," she said slowly. "It's the way you handle it. Most people are either too rough or too careful. You seem thoughtful." The engineer's heart skipped a beat at her words. Was that a compliment? He couldn't tell, but the way she said it made him wonder if there was something more to it. Was she genuinely curious about him? Or was this just another test, another way for her to evaluate his worth? Trying to keep his mind focused on the task, the engineer returned to his work. But now every movement seemed to matter more. He was hyper-aware of how his fingers touched the metal, how he adjusted each piece with precision. It was as if Kalira's words had placed him under a microscope, her silent observation making everything feel more important than it had before. "Why do you think people are afraid of my armor?" Kalira asked, her tone thoughtful. The question caught the engineer off guard. He paused, his tool halfway to the armor. "I suppose it's because it's so intimidating. Your species, your people, you're known for your strength and your power. The armor reflects that. It's built for battle, for survival." Kalira's eyes narrowed slightly, but not in anger, more like curiosity. She tilted her head slightly as if considering his answer. Strength doesn't always come from power, she said softly. Sometimes strength comes from something else, something deeper. The engineer could sense the weight of her words, but he wasn't sure how to respond. What did she mean by that? Was she talking about her warrior nature, or was there something else behind her statement? I've spent my life proving myself in battle, Kalira continued, her voice quieter now, almost distant. It's all I've ever known. But sometimes I wonder if that's all I am. The engineer couldn't help but feel sympathy for her, though he didn't fully understand what she meant. He had always admired warriors, admired their strength and determination, but now hearing her speak so openly about her struggles, he began to see a side of her that he hadn't expected. Maybe strength comes from more than just fighting, the engineer said carefully, unsure if his words would make sense to her. Maybe it comes from the ability to let someone in, to trust someone with something important. Kalira looked at him then, her gaze intense but not cold. There was a moment of silence, and for the first time, the engineer thought he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. It was gone in an instant, replaced by her usual stoic expression, but he had seen it. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she turned her attention back to the armor, her hands resting on the edges of the piece he was repairing. The engineer finished the last adjustment, securing the final piece in place. He stood up, wiping his hands on a cloth, and stepped back to admire his work. Kalira remained silent for a moment longer before she finally spoke. "You've done well," she said, her voice now tinged with a hint of approval. "Thank you." The engineer nodded, his heart pounding a little faster. "It was my pleasure, ma'am." Kalira stood tall, her armor now fully repaired and ready for use. She seemed to regain her usual confidence, but there was something different in the way she carried herself, something softer. "Perhaps. I will not underestimate you next time," she said with a small, almost imperceptible smile. The engineer blinked, surprised by the change in her tone. "I didn't think you would." Kalira didn't respond, but as she turned to leave, the engineer couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. She was a warrior, proud and fierce, but there was something else behind her eyes. Something that wasn't just about power. The tension between them was still there, but now it felt different. It wasn't just about repairing armor anymore. It was something more complicated, more personal. As Kalira walked away, the engineer found himself watching her, his mind racing with thoughts he hadn't expected. The days passed, and the engineer found himself thinking more and more about Kalira. He couldn't quite explain it, but something about her lingered in his thoughts. Perhaps it was her strength, her presence, or the quiet intensity that she carried with her wherever she went. Every time he crossed paths with her in the hangar or during the mission, he felt the weight of her gaze, but it wasn't the same as before. The cold, intimidating warrior he had met was slowly starting to feel like someone else, a person he couldn't quite figure out. He was working on another piece of equipment when he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up and saw Kalira walking toward him, her expression as unreadable as ever. But there was something in the way she held herself, a subtle shift that made him pause. "Engineer," she said, her voice low, but not unkind. "I need your assistance, again." He wiped his hands on his cloth and stood up quickly. "Of course, Kalira. What can I help with?" Kalira stood before him, her hands clasped behind her back. "It's about my armor. There are still a few adjustments I want you to make." Her words were straightforward, but her eyes, those deep, dark eyes, seemed to carry something unspoken, something that made the engineer's heart beat a little faster. He nodded, trying to push aside the strange feelings that had been building inside him. "I'll take a look right away." Kalira led him to a secluded part of the hangar where the rest of the soldiers were busy with their own tasks. The quiet of the space made the moment feel more intimate, and for the first time the engineer could feel the tension between them in a way he hadn't before. As he started inspecting her armor once more, he couldn't help but notice how she watched him closely. Her gaze wasn't sharp or critical like before, but it was intense, as though she was waiting for something. He wasn't sure what, but he felt it in the air, a silent challenge that hung between them. This armor, the engineer began as he checked the joints and systems. It's built for a lot of strain. You've been through some tough battles, haven't you? Kalira nodded, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. Yes, I've fought many wars, and this armor has been through more than I can count. But there are always new things to learn. New ways to improve it. The engineer glanced up at her. I thought you were already the best. Kalira's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. Best doesn't mean perfect. There is always room to grow. There was a moment of silence, and the engineer couldn't help but feel like there was more to her words than just talking about armor. He carefully adjusted a piece of her chest plate, but his hands were more careful now, aware of her proximity. The way she stood so still and composed made him feel as if he were walking on a fine line. Why did you ask me to fix your armor again? He asked suddenly, his curiosity getting the better of him. You've always had skilled technicians to do it before. Kalira's gaze softened for a moment and the engineer almost missed it. You handle it differently. You're careful with it. She paused, as if considering her next words. And you didn't treat me like I was just another warrior. I noticed that. The engineer felt a slight flush rise to his cheeks, though he quickly composed himself. I'm just trying to do my job well. Kalira stepped a little closer, her presence overwhelming in the quiet space. Your job is more than just fixing machines, isn't it? The engineer stopped for a moment, his fingers lingering on the armor. He hadn't expected her to ask such a question, and it took him off guard. He wasn't sure how to answer. I'm just here to make sure things work properly, he said, his voice quieter than usual. I don't think much beyond that. But Kalira didn't seem convinced. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. You think so little of yourself? She asked, a challenge in her voice. He looked up at her, meeting her intense gaze. There was a flicker of something unfamiliar, in her eyes. He could feel his own thoughts swirling, unsure of what she was trying to say. I just do what's necessary, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. It's all I know how to do. Kalira was silent for a long time, and the engineer continued his work, his mind racing. He could feel her standing there, her presence, a constant pull. It was as if she had the ability to command not just attention, but something deeper, a kind of quiet authority that he couldn't escape. After a long pause, Kalira spoke again, her voice softer now. You don't have to hide behind your work. I see you, engineer. Her words sent a shiver down his spine. He had never thought of himself as someone who needed to be seen, at least not by someone like Kalira. But the way she spoke made him question everything he had thought he knew about her. Why do you say that? He asked, his curiosity winning over his usual guardedness. Kalira took another step closer, her eyes never leaving his. Because I see more than just the engineer who fixes things, she said quietly. I see a person who doesn't give himself enough credit, someone who has something more to offer than just technical skills. The engineer felt a knot form in his stomach. Kalira's words were not what he expected. They were too personal, too intimate for someone like her. She was a warrior, strong, proud, and unyielding. She didn't seem like the kind of person who would spend time analyzing someone like him. I'm just here to help, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Kalira stepped back, giving him space. The moment passed, and she returned to her stoic demeanor. You're more than just your job, engineer, she said, her voice cold, once more. Remember that. The engineer watched her as she walked away, the weight of her words still hanging in the air. She didn't look back, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. He had felt it, even if she hadn't shown it, something deeper, something that neither of them could ignore for much longer. The days following the encounter in the hangar felt different. The engineer couldn't stop thinking about Kalira's words. Her gaze, her presence, everything about her lingered in his thoughts, and he found it harder to focus on his work. It wasn't just her strength that impressed him. It was something deeper, something he hadn't expected. But as much as he tried to shake it off, the connection between them seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. It was early in the morning when Kalira found him again. The engineer was adjusting the power systems in one of the maintenance rooms when he heard her familiar footsteps approach. He didn't need to turn around to know it was her. Her presence always filled the room, commanding attention without saying a word. "Engineer?" Kalira's voice was firm, but there was a slight softness to it now. "I need you to test something for me." The engineer turned around, surprised by the request. "What kind of test?" Kalira didn't immediately answer. Instead, she stepped into the room, her dark eyes meeting his. "It's a test of strength," she said slowly, her tone serious. "I want to see if you can handle it." The engineer's brow furrowed. "Test of strength? What do you mean?" Kalira motioned to a heavy piece of equipment against the wall, something he had been working on for a while but had never fully understood. "Lift it," she ordered. The engineer glanced at the equipment, then back at Kalira. He wasn't sure why she was asking him to do this, but he could tell that it wasn't a simple task. The equipment was massive, its weight clearly more than what a human could comfortably handle. But Kalira wasn't known for asking easy things. "I don't think I can lift that," he said cautiously. Kalira didn't seem fazed. "Try. Show me your strength." The engineer hesitated. He had no idea what she was trying to prove, but the challenge in her eyes told him there was no way out. With a deep breath, he approached the equipment, bracing himself for the effort it would take. He placed his hands on the cold metal and tried to lift it. It was heavier than anything he had ever tried to move before. His muscles strained and his feet slid slightly on the smooth floor. But no matter how hard he tried, the equipment barely budged. Kalira watched silently, her gaze steady and unwavering. "You're not trying hard enough." The engineer paused, his hand still on the equipment, his breath coming in short gasps. "I'm giving it everything I have," he replied, frustration creeping into his voice. Kalira stepped closer. Her presence was almost overpowering, and he could feel her watching him like a hawk. "You're thinking too much. Strength comes from within, not just your muscles." She placed one hand on the equipment, and with a simple shift of her body, she lifted it with ease, moving it as if it were a weightless object. The engineer's eyes widened in awe as he watched her, her strength seemingly limitless. "See?" Kalira said, her voice calm but filled with an unspoken challenge. "Strength is not just about what you can lift. It's about how you approach the challenge. You have to believe you can do it or you'll fail before you even start." The engineer stood there for a moment, speechless. It wasn't the lesson he had expected, but it was one that made sense in a way he hadn't considered before. He had been too focused on the physical limitations of the task instead of the mindset that could help him overcome it. Kalira set the equipment down with a quiet thud. "You're not just an engineer, are you?" she asked, turning to face him fully. "You're a problem solver. You find solutions, even when things seem impossible. Strength comes in many forms. Yours is different from mine, but it's just as important." The engineer looked at her, still processing her words. "I never thought about it like that," he admitted. "I've always been focused on the details, the small things that make everything work. But I've never had to face something like this." Kalira's gaze softened ever so slightly, a rare vulnerability showing through her usual fierce exterior. "We all have our challenges," she said quietly. "It's not about how much you can lift. It's about what you do when you can't lift it." The engineer nodded, feeling a new sense of understanding begin to form inside him. Kalira's strength was undeniable, but it wasn't just her physical power that made her a warrior. It was her mind, her approach to every challenge she faced. And maybe, just maybe, he could learn something from that. Kalira stepped back, her arms crossing over her chest as she regarded him. "I've tested your strength. Now I want to test your resolve." "Resolve?" the engineer repeated, unsure of what she meant. "You're good with machines, but can you face something that doesn't have a simple solution?" Kalira asked, her eyes searching his. Can you handle the unknown? The things you can't control? The engineer stood taller, his resolve hardening. I've faced problems before. I don't shy away from them. Kalira gave a small nod. We'll see. The galaxy is full of challenges that don't have clear answers. Not everything can be solved with a tool or a machine. Sometimes it's about having the will to keep going, even when you don't know what's ahead. Her words resonated with him, and for the first time, he realized that Kalira wasn't just testing his strength in a physical sense. She was testing his ability to adapt, to grow beyond his technical skills, and to face the challenges of the universe with a warrior's mindset. Kalira turned and walked toward the door, her steps measured and confident. Keep that in mind, she said over her shoulder, her voice carrying an edge of something deeper, something that spoke of respect. The galaxy isn't kind to those who don't know how to keep moving forward. The engineer stood there for a moment, reflecting on everything she had said. The test wasn't just about physical strength, it was about mental strength, about facing the unknown with determination and courage. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a shift inside himself, as though he were beginning to understand what it meant to truly be strong. The days grew colder as the mission continued, and the engineer found himself caught between his work and the lingering thoughts of Kalira. The tension between them, though unspoken, seemed to grow with each passing encounter. She would come to him with requests for repairs, and he would fulfill them, his hands steady but his mind far away. Every time their paths crossed, the connection between them felt stronger, but neither of them spoke of it. It remained something unspoken, a force neither was ready to acknowledge. One afternoon, as the engineer was finishing up his work in the hangar, Kalira approached him again. She didn't say anything at first, she never did, but there was something in the way she stood there, in the way her eyes met his, that made him stop what he was doing. You've been working hard, Kalira said finally, her voice softer than usual. The engineer looked up at her, wiping his hands on his cloth. It's part of the job, he replied with a small smile, trying to keep things casual. But there was something different in her presence today. Her usual sharpness had softened, and for the first time she seemed almost vulnerable. Kalira glanced around the hangar, her gaze moving over the equipment and machinery. You fixed all of this with your hands, she observed. You understand how it works, don't you? The engineer nodded, still unsure where she was going with this conversation. Yes, it's all about understanding the pieces, how they fit together, how they need to function. Every detail matters. Kalira stepped closer, her eyes never leaving him. And what about you, engineer? She asked, her voice quieter now. Do you understand yourself? Do you know how you fit into the bigger picture? The question took him off guard. He paused, his fingers stilling for a moment on the tools he was holding. I don't really think about it that way, he admitted. I'm just here to help, to do what I can. Kalira studied him, her gaze searching as if she was trying to understand something deep within him. Maybe you don't realize it, but you're more than just someone who fixes machines. You're someone who sees the bigger picture. Someone who can find the connections when others can't. The engineer felt a knot form in his chest. Her words were unexpected, and yet they seemed to strike a chord within him. He had never really thought of himself in that way. To him, he was just an engineer, a person who understood how things worked, but nothing more. Kalira's words made him question that assumption. I'm not sure what you mean, he said, softly, still trying to understand. Kalira's expression softened and she took a step closer. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, something that neither of them had addressed until now. You've been here all this time, and yet you still don't see what you're capable of, she said, her voice gentle but firm. You have more strength than you realize, more courage. The engineer felt his heart race at her words. He wasn't sure how to respond. Kalira wasn't just talking about the armor or the machines anymore. She was talking about him, about his own strength, his own abilities. but he couldn't bring himself to believe it. He had never seen himself as strong or courageous. He was just ordinary. "I'm just trying to do my job," he said quietly, trying to push aside the thoughts that were starting to swirl in his mind. Kalira shook her head. "It's more than that. You've been tested, just like I have, but you've been afraid to see it. You've been afraid to acknowledge your own potential." The engineer swallowed hard, feeling a mixture of confusion and something else. Something like fear. What was she trying to say? Was she saying that he was more than just an engineer, that he had more to offer than he had realized? Kalira stepped even closer, her presence filling the space between them. She reached out, her hand hovering just inches from his. The gesture wasn't aggressive, but it held a weight of something, unspoken, something that both of them had been avoiding. "I don't want you to be afraid," Kalira said softly. "Not of me, not of anyone, not of what you can become." For a moment, the engineer stood there, unsure of what to do or say. Her words lingered in the air, their weight pressing down on him. He had spent so much of his life focused on the small things, the details, the repairs, the tasks at hand. But now, standing in front of Kalira, he realized that there was something bigger at play. There was something more to him than he had ever allowed himself to believe. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I don't know if I can be what you think I am," he said softly. "I'm not like you. I don't have the strength you do." Kalira's eyes softened, and she placed a hand gently on his arm. "Strength doesn't always come from what you can do. Sometimes it comes from what you're willing to face, what you're willing to challenge inside yourself." The engineer felt her touch like a spark, and for a moment, he felt something shift inside him. It was subtle, but it was there. A change, a realization that he had been holding himself back all this time. Maybe he wasn't as weak as he had thought. Maybe there was more to him than just the engineer who fixed things. Kalira took a step back, her expression still steady but not as distant as it had been before. "I've crossed many boundaries in my life," she said quietly. "But there are some that are worth crossing. You just have to be willing to take that first step." The engineer looked at her, his mind racing. He didn't fully understand everything she was saying, but there was something about her words that resonated with him, something that made him question his own limitations. "Maybe I'm starting to understand," he said softly. Kalira nodded, as if she knew he was beginning to see it. "Good, because there's a lot more to this universe than you've seen, and you're capable of so much more than just fixing machines." The engineer watched her as she turned to leave, her confidence once again radiating from her. But this time he didn't feel just like the person who fixed things. For the first time he felt like someone who could do more, someone who had the strength to face the unknown. As Kalira walked away, he found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, the boundaries he had been afraid to cross weren't as far away as he had once believed. The days after their conversation felt different. The engineer couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between him and Kalira. She continued to request his help with her armor and other repairs, but each time their paths crossed, there was an unspoken tension in the air. It was as though a new understanding had developed between them, one that neither had fully addressed, but both could feel. He had started to notice small things about her, like how her posture softened when she wasn't on duty, or how she would quietly observe the others when they worked as though studying them from afar. He couldn't help but think there was more to Kalira than the powerful warrior she let the world see. On one particularly quiet afternoon, when the hangar was mostly empty, the engineer was tinkering with a piece of equipment when Kalira approached him again. This time, however, there was no immediate request for repairs. She simply stood there watching him work. He paused and looked up, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Kalira," he said, a hint of surprise in his voice. "I didn't expect you to come by today." Kalira nodded slightly, her eyes soft. "I didn't come for repairs," she said, her tone quieter than usual. "I came to talk." The engineer set his tools aside, his curiosity piqued. He had never seen Kalira like this before, calm, almost gentle. She was always a force of nature, fierce and strong, but now there was a different kind of strength in her presence. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice filled with an openness he hadn't realized he was capable of. Kalira stood, for a moment as if gathering her thoughts. She seemed hesitant, and the engineer found himself wondering if she was unsure about what she was going to say next. The Kalira he knew never hesitated. She was always confident, always direct. "I've been thinking about something," she began slowly, her gaze meeting his. "About strength, about how we define it." The engineer raised an eyebrow. "I thought strength was something you always knew, Kalira. Something you had from the moment you were born." She gave a small shake of her head, her eyes reflecting a depth of emotion he hadn't expected. "It's not as simple as that," she said softly. "I've spent my whole life fighting, proving myself, trying to be strong. But the more I fight, the more I realize that strength isn't just about what you can do with your body. It's about what you can do with your heart." The engineer felt a weight settle on his chest as her words sank in. He hadn't expected this conversation to take this turn, and he wasn't sure what to say. He had always thought of strength as something physical, the ability to lift, to fight, to survive. But Kalira was challenging that notion, making him rethink everything he had ever known. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kalira looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "I've always thought that being strong meant I couldn't show weakness, that I couldn't let anyone in. But now I'm starting to understand that true strength is being able to let someone see the parts of you that are broken, the parts you've kept hidden." The engineer felt a wave of understanding wash over him. For the first time, he saw Kalira not just as the fierce warrior who could defeat anyone in battle, but as a person with her own struggles, her own vulnerabilities. And it made him realize that perhaps, just perhaps, he had been hiding his own vulnerabilities as well. "I've spent so much of my life hiding behind my work," he said quietly, his voice almost uncertain. "I've always thought that if I just kept fixing things, kept focusing on the machines, I wouldn't have to face anything else. But now, I'm starting to see that maybe I've been avoiding something more important." Kalira nodded, a small but meaningful smile appearing on her lips. "We both have our walls," she said softly, "and sometimes those walls keep us from seeing what we're really capable of." The engineer looked at her, feeling the weight of her words in his chest. He had never thought of himself as someone with walls, but now, looking at Kalira, he realized that he had built his own defenses without even knowing it. He had always thought that fixing machines was enough, that if he could just make things work, everything would fall into place. But Kalira's words were making him see that perhaps there was more to life than just fixing what was broken. "I think I understand now," he said, his voice steady. "It's not just about fixing things. It's about understanding them. Understanding the parts that can't be fixed, the parts that need to be accepted." Kalira stepped a little closer, her eyes softening. "Exactly," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "Strength is about facing the parts of yourself that you're afraid of, not just the parts that are easy to fix." The engineer felt something shift inside him, a sense of clarity he hadn't felt before. Kalira was right. He had spent so much of his life hiding behind his work, behind the safety of machines and repairs. But now, standing here with Kalira, he felt as though he was finally starting to understand what it meant to be truly strong. He took a deep breath and looked at her. "I'm not sure I can be everything you think I am," he admitted, his voice full of honesty. "But I want to try. I want to face what's inside me, the things I've been avoiding." Kalira smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "That's all anyone can ask for," she said softly. "To try." For the first time, the engineer felt as though he was seeing Kalira, not as the warrior, not as the powerful alien, but as someone who, like him, was learning and growing. And in that moment, he realized that strength wasn't just about what you could do. It was about what you were willing to face and who you were willing to become. Kalira turned to leave, but before she walked away, she looked back at him. "Remember," she said quietly, "we don't have to be perfect. We just have to be real." The engineer stood there watching her leave, and for the first time, he felt ready to face the things he had kept hidden. It wasn't going to be easy, but with Kalira's words echoing in his mind, he knew he was finally on the path to something greater.